When you watch The Lord of the Rings, one thing becomes clear almost immediately. There are hardly any elves left. We see Rivendell, quiet, scholarly, beautiful, and Lothlórien, shimmering under its golden canopy like a place untouched by time. But both feel remote, fragile, like the last lights of a world long since dimmed. And that's because they are. These places are the final remnants of something far greater, the fading echoes of an elven civilization that once spanned an entire continent. Before the Third Age, before the rise of men, long before the War of the Ring, the elves ruled mighty realms in a land called Beleriand, towering cities, hidden fortresses, forest kingdoms woven with enchantments, entire cultures that shaped the fate of the world. Welcome back to You Shall Not Scroll, where we explore the lost legends, forgotten ages, and hidden depths of Tolkien's world. Today we're going back, all the way back, to explore the elven realms of the First Age. To understand these realms, you first have to understand how important elves were to Tolkien himself. He didn't begin his legendarium with hobbits or dwarves or the Númenóreans. He began with elves. In the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, he openly admits, "The stories were conceived as a background to my elvish languages." That's letter 131. This entire fictional universe, thousands of years of history, dozens of peoples, all the great wars, was originally created to give a believable world for his elvish languages to grow in. He also writes in letter 144, "The elves are the chief artificers of beauty in this world." To Tolkien, the elves represented the height of artistic creation, the intertwining of myth, language, memory, and loss. That love for the elves is nowhere more visible than in the First Age, when their kingdoms reached their greatest glory. But to get to those kingdoms, we have to start at the very beginning. The elves awoke at Cuiviénen, in the far east of Middle-earth, under starlight, long before the sun and moon ever rose. Their earliest moments were shaped by wonder and beauty, and by fear as well. When the Valar discovered them, they summoned the elves to come live with them in Valinor, the land of the gods. But not all elves made the journey. Some went west, some stayed behind, others turned aside along the way. This created the great divisions of the elven kindreds, the Vanyar, the Noldor, the Teleri, who went to Valinor, and the Sindar and many others who remained in Middle-earth. The Noldor, who lived for centuries in the light of the two trees, were forever changed by their time in Valinor. They learned from the Valar and Maiar directly. They became craftsmen and scholars of unmatched genius. And when they eventually returned to Middle-earth, under dark circumstances, their arrival transformed Beleriand. The Sindar had dwelt in Middle-earth for ages, but the Noldor came with a power, confidence, and a cultural brilliance that made their realms flourish. Yet one Sindarin king stood apart from all the others, one who had seen the light of Valinor and who ruled a kingdom unlike any other. That king was Thingol. That brings us to Doriath, the oldest and greatest of the Sindarin realms. Thingol, Doriath's ruler, had journeyed to Valinor as an emissary, with Ingwe and Finwë being the leaders of their peoples. They were the first elves to go to Valinor and behold the light of the trees. There was no sun and moon yet, and Middle-earth was in perpetual darkness. Thingol and the others came back to Middle-earth, and they convinced a majority of their people to migrate west to Valinor. But on the journey, Thingol saw something in the wilds of Beleriand that enchanted him, and he stayed behind. He had met Melian, a Maya of immeasurable wisdom and beauty who had left Valinor to live in Middle-earth. Thingol stayed behind in Beleriand to be with Melian, the only union between Maiar and a child of Iluvatar in the entire legendarium. Tolkien uses the notion of ennoblement a lot in the legendarium, and the offspring of Thingol and Melian are unique in that they have divine genes, and this will eventually make its way to the race of men through kings like Elros and Aragorn. Since Thingol had seen the light of the two trees and had been to Valinor, he was the most wise and powerful elf in Middle-earth, and Melian was an angelical being in a body of flesh. They were formidable, and their union shaped the destiny of the entire First Age. Together, they founded the Kingdom of Doriath, a vast forest realm about the great river Sirion, containing the forests Neldoreth, Nivarim, Region, Oradarim, Brethil, and Non-Elmoth. Foreseeing war, Melian counseled Thingol to ally with the dwarves in the Blue Mountains, and he did. They carved the caverns of Menegroth, the Thousand Caves, which became Doriath's capital. It was one of the most beautiful cities Tolkien ever imagined. It was carved deep into the stone, but decorated like a living forest. Melian also used her Maya powers to create a barrier around most of Doriath that enemies could not cross, known as the Girdle of Melian. Few friends could even find its borders. So Thingol was the lone ruler of the Sindar Elves, and Doriath became a sanctuary, a center of lore, and a place of ancient majesty. It was the heart of Beleriand, That was until a kindred of elves decided to come back to Middle-earth from Valinor. The Noldor returned, a race of elves who had lived and thrived in Valinor. They were known for being the Deep Elves and Lore Masters. They were the best craftsmen of their age, and their leader Feanor created the Silmarils and the Seven Seeing Stones. They were bringing a lot of knowledge and power with them to Middle-earth. Why they decided to leave and how they got there can be its own video, but let's just say their arrival was anything but quiet. They came out of the frozen north, crossing the grinding ice, carrying with them the grief of the kinslaying and the shadow of the doom of Mandos. While others sailed to Middle-earth in stolen ships, they came with fire, literally. When they first set foot in Beleriand, they lit their ships on the coastline of Loskar, and the flames could be seen for miles. It was a symbolic break from Valinor and a break from their kin, a declaration that they were here to wage their own war against Morgoth and claim their own realms. At first, the Sindar did not know who these newcomers were. Rumors spread across Beleriand. Tall, proud elves armed with bright mail, shining swords, and a strange light in their eyes, the light of Valinor. They seemed like lords out of legend. Many Sindar were curious, others were afraid. But one person above all needed answers, King Thingol. When Thingol finally learned who these strangers were, he summoned the Noldoran princes to his court in Doriath. They came with courtesy and spoke with respect, but they hid one crucial truth, the kinslaying at Akolande, where Thingol's own kin had been killed for their ships. For a time, relations were civil. Thingol even allowed them to dwell in his lands, so long as they accepted Sindarin customs and peace. But tension simmered beneath the surface. The Noldor were used to ruling, used to shaping lands and peoples according to their will. The Sindar, especially those loyal to Thingol, saw these newcomers as proud, restless, and far too eager for war. Eventually, when the truth of the kinslaying reached him, through Angrod's unwitting confession and later through Círdan's warning, Thingol was outraged. He forbade the use of Quenya in his realm, the language the Noldor spoke, allowing only Sindarin speech within his borders. This is why, even in The Lord of the Rings, the languages of the elves in Middle-earth are overwhelmingly Sindarin. Yet despite this deep tension, the Noldor were not expelled. Thingol needed strong allies against Morgoth, and he recognized that these princes were mighty indeed. So an uneasy peace grew between them. The Noldor held the north and western fronts, consistently battling the forces of Angband, while Doriath remained the cultural and spiritual center of Beleriand. This complicated relationship, strained, respectful, resentful, and yet necessary, shaped the political landscape of the entire First Age. And out of this fragile alliance emerged the first great Noldoran realm in Middle-earth, the kingdom of Fingolfin and Hithlum. Feanor died almost immediately upon landing in Middle-earth, so the High Kingship of the Noldor passed to his half-brother Fingolfin. He was the one who set up the first Noldoran realms in Middle-earth. This was to the northwest of Beleriand in a land named Hithlum, a cold land of mountains and windswept plains. Though harsh, it was a vital frontier facing the shadow of Angband to the north. They wanted to keep their enemy close but still be protected and gather their strength. In Hithlum stood Barad Ithel, a fortress guarding the passes. In time, this region also included Lomin, which later became the homeland of the House of Hador, one of the mightiest houses of men. After defeating the orcs in the Dagger Aglerbed, also known as the Glorious Battle, in the year 60 of the First Age, Fingolfin helped to maintain the siege of Angband for nearly 400 years. Fingolfin gained the friendship of Thingol eventually and added the strength of the men of Hador to his armies. The 400-year siege on Morgoth ended with the Dagger Bragarloch, or the Battle of Sudden Flame. After being beaten back with great losses to the fortress of Eredwithrin, Fingolfin did something both valiant and terrible. In my favorite moment of the Legendarium, he challenged Morgoth to a one-on-one fight, and he scared Morgoth with the challenge. He was struck down, but not without permanently harming Morgoth. Fingolfin's son Fingon then became the High King of the Noldor. Fingolfin's people were hardened warriors, always on the front lines, always watching for Morgoth's next assault. Even though this technically wasn't a kingdom, it was important as the first settlement of the Noldor and Beleriand, and they helped stem the tide of Morgoth, so the others could create kingdoms further south. Fingolfin had another son named Turgon, and he was the first to set up a Noldoran kingdom in Middle-earth, and the only to have two different kingdoms. Before he came the Lord of Gondolin, he ruled from Nevrast, a quiet coastal land with sweeping shores and lonely cliffs. Its capital, Vienmar, was a place of stillness and contemplation. He ruled here for about a century, until he was visited in a dream by Umo the Vala and Lord of Waters. In the dream, Turgon was told to seek for a new location to build a kingdom. so he eventually abandoned the coastlands. Nevrast stood empty after Turgon and his people left, but eventually Tuor, one of the most important men of the age, followed 7 swans to Vienmar, and there he found a sword and shield bearing the device of a white swan on a blue field. Tuor took these down to the shore, where Ulmo also appeared to him and told him to seek for Gondolin. Then he gave him a cloak that had the power to hide him from his enemies. The next morning, Ulmo sent a shipwrecked elf named Varanwe to the shores of Vienmar, and they journeyed to Gondolin together. Nevrast was temporary, but it was the bridge to something far greater. The next Noldoran kingdom came from Finrod Felagund, who happens to be my favorite character in the Legendarium. Finrod is Galadriel's brother and Fingolfin's nephew. After the first battle of the Noldor and Morgoth in Beleriand, Dagor Nuin Gileath battle under stars, Finrod established a tower named Minas Tirith, yes, the same name as the city in Gondor, on the island of Tol Sirion. But one day, while he was traveling south on the river Sirion with his cousin Turgon, Ulmo the Valar came up the river and laid a dream on them. In this dream, they were bidden to prepare for a day of evil and to establish strongholds to resist Morgoth, in case he should come openly to war. Turgon would go on to establish Gondolin, and Finrod would establish Nargothrond. While Finrod and Galadriel were staying with their kinsmen Thingol and Doriath, he told Finrod of a deep gorge in the river Narog where there were caves under the High Faroth in its deep western shores. That's where Finrod found the caves of Narog, and he established deep halls and armories. He also brought jewels and treasures from Valinor that he stored in the caves. Thus, Nargothrond was founded. This realm combined the grandeur of Menegroth with the secrecy and strength of the Noldor. The dwarves of the Blue Mountains helped Finrod build his kingdom, just like they did with Thingol. Finrod paid them in some jewels from Valinor, and in that time, the Naglamir, which plays a vital part in the future of the Legendarium, was made for him. Finrod was not only a king, but a friend to men, and his alliance with them, especially with the House of Beor, would shape the great tale of Beren and Luthien. Nargothrond was subtle, powerful, and wise. It was a realm of hidden strength. Initially, Turgon left Tumlodin after Ulmo guided him there, and returned to Vienmar, keeping his discovery a secret for many years and planning the construction of a city. After the dagger Aglerbed, Turgon began to once again feel the restlessness set in his heart by Ulmo, and his thought turned to Tumlodin and the protection it provided. The valley was within the encircling mountains and had been a lake before it emptied. In the middle of the valley was a hill that had been an island in the past. The hill was named Amon Gwarth, and Turgon decided to found his city upon it, as a memorial to Tirion upon Tuna, the chief elven city of Valinor. Turgon then took his most skilled people to the hidden valley of Tumlodin, and they began the building of Gondolin. Ulmo protected the valley, and the elves watched from its borders. The city was completed in 52 years, and during that time, Turgon lived mainly in Nevrast. When it was completed, he took his people, who consisted of Fingolfin's followers and native Sindar, in secret to Gondolin, where they lived and continued to build up the city until it rivaled Tirion itself. Its most prominent feature was the Great Tower of the King, and there were many fountains and 7 gates. It was the crown jewel of the Noldor, completely invisible to friends and foe alike. Here, Turgon built a realm of beauty, artistry, and unmatched martial strength. The houses of Gondolin, like the House of the Golden Flower and the House of the Fountain, with many others, became legends in their own right. Glorfindel, Icthelion, and countless other heroes walked its streets. For centuries, Gondolin stood untouched, a beacon of hope against Morgoth. Next, we move to East Beleriand, where the Sons of Fëanor have their domains. Their realms were not large built-up cities, but rather spread out forts and encampments. Maedhros held the March of Maedhros, with a fortress on Himring, a stronghold so well placed and so well built that it withstood countless attacks from the north. His brothers ruled lands spread across East Beleriand. Maglar had Maglar's Gap and patrolled along the Great Road. Caranthir was in Thargelion, and the twins Amrod and Amros in the southern woods. And lastly, Celegorm and Cuiviénen held the Pass of Aglon, a key defensive point against Morgoth. These territories collectively formed a great defensive network, a buffer between Morgoth and the western Noldoran kingdoms. Finally, there was Ossiriand, the land of 7 rivers. Its people, the Laquendi or Green-Elves, were quiet and reclusive, living in harmony with the forest and rarely engaging in the wars of the Noldor. Like the Sindar, they never went to Valinor. They had no great cities, no fortresses, but they possessed a deep connection to the natural world. Though peaceful, their role in the First Age would become more important as the tragedies mounted. With the realms established, we now turn to their fates, one by one. The elves at this point have the most dominion and power over Middle-earth they would ever have. The event that started their downfall was one of the worst tragedies in all of Tolkien's Legendarium. In the year 472 of the First Age was the Nirnaeth Arnoriad, or the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Fingon, Turgon, and Maedhros allied with the Edain, dwarves, and newly arrived Easterlings to defeat Morgoth and throw down Angmar. Unfortunately though, they were defeated by treachery. At the end of the battle, Fingon had died and Turgon was the new High King of the Noldor. He would fall back to Gondolin with his people and never leave its valley again. Morgoth now had complete control of the north of Beleriand, but he didn't kill Turgon and he had no idea where Gondolin was. Even so, the once mighty watchlands of the Noldor vanished under shadow. 7 years before the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, Finrod, the king of Nargothrond, died in the very tower he built, Minas Tirith. He was bound by an oath to help the House of Beor in time of need, for they had saved his life. Beren came to collect on that debt. He needed Finrod's help in getting a Cimmerel so he could marry Luthien. On their journey, they were eventually captured and imprisoned, and Finrod ended up sacrificing himself by killing a werewolf with nothing but his hands and teeth so Beren could escape. His nephew, Orodreth, ruled after him, but the realm changed. A tragic man named Turin, who was Hurin's son, came and lived in Nargothrond, and the people loved him for he was a valiant warrior. He counseled to fight Morgoth in the open, and eventually brought the downfall of the kingdom. To hasten his armies out of the city, he built a great bridge across the river and into the main entrance, exposing Nargothrond to direct attack. This allowed the father of dragons, Glaurung, and an army to enter the city. Nargothrond burned, its people scattered, it became a tomb beneath the earth. The Cimmerel that Beren eventually took from Morgoth's crown with Luthien's help became the Doom of Doriath. Though it shone with the light of the two trees, it also carried with it the Oath of Feanor and the unstoppable demand of his sons to reclaim it. It was such a precious thing that when Thingol found himself with it and the Naglamir, he commissioned the dwarves to combine them, the greatest works of their two kinds, into one. The dwarves ended up coveting the work of their fathers and the Cimmerel. They refused to hand them over once they were done. Thingol died in the ensuing fight over them. After Thingol's death, Melian left Middle-earth and her protection of Doriath left with her. Their grandson, Dior, the child of Beren and Luthien, took the throne. He only ruled for about 3 years though, because the Sons of Fëanor once again demanded that the Cimmerel was theirs by right, since their father made it and they swore an oath to obtain them. But Dior refused to surrender it. That's when the second kinslaying happened, which is fitting since their father caused the first one. The Sons of Fëanor and their followers attacked Doriath and did evil deeds, but luckily the Cimmerel escaped their grasp. In the end, Menegroth was destroyed. The oldest elven kingdom of Beleriand ceased to exist. That left one last elven kingdom in Beleriand, the mightiest and grandest of them all, Gondolin. The city was still hidden, and Morgoth wanted to destroy it and the elves in Beleriand. This is why Turgon, the king, had a strict command of anyone who left or entered the city, and very few did. One who was permitted to enter was his nephew, Maeglin, who was led there by his mom. Maeglin disobeyed Turgon one day and strayed far from the city looking for ore. He was then captured by Morgoth's troops and revealed the city's location. He was also motivated to betrayal because he loved Turgon's daughter Idril, but she was in love with a man named Tuor, who happens to be Elrond's grandfather, but we'll get to that later. What followed was one of the most dramatic battles in all of Tolkien's writings. Morgoth sent a massive army of Balrogs, orcs, wolves, and dragons into the city during a time when the people were preparing for the Gates of Summer festival. They were caught completely off guard. Dragons poured into the streets. Balrogs clashed with the houses of Gondolin. Flames lit the night sky. Luckily, Idril had a tunnel dug for just such an occasion, and she got out of the city with her husband and their 7-year-old son named Earendil, along with a small group of survivors. While they were cresting the mountains and close to safety, they were ambushed by orcs and a Balrog. That's when the elf Glorfindel saved the survivors by fighting the Balrog to the death. He was rewarded for his sacrifice and rehoused into a new body, and he's the same Glorfindel in The Lord of the Rings. Another amazing moment in the battle is when Ecthelion, a mighty lord of Gondolin, slew Gothmog, the lord of the Balrogs, and died in the act. Turgon stayed to fight for his city, and he fell in defense of the Tower of the King, and mighty was its fall, and the fall of Turgon in its ruin. The final Elven kingdom had fallen to Morgoth, and the Elves of Beleriand were in a terrible situation. The survivors of Gondolin went down the river Sirion until they came to the sea. There they met the remnants of Doriath and banded together by the mouth of the river. It was a place of desperation and hope, elves and men side by side holding on to the last light of the First Age. Here Earendil, son of Tuor and Idril, grew to adulthood. He married Elwing, granddaughter of Beren and Luthien. She had come to the Havens from Doriath and brought the Silmaril with her. Since Earendil was of both elf and mankind, he took it upon himself to sail into the west and seek for the Valar. He wanted the Valar's help in overthrowing Morgoth, since his defeat of the elves was nearly complete. Before he left, he had twins, Elrond and Elros. After Earendil left, the Sons of Fëanor heard about the Silmaril being at the Havens, and they assaulted them and committed the third and final kinslaying. Elwing escaped with the Silmaril, casting herself into the sea, and through Uml's power, she was transformed into a white bird and flew to Earendil. The Sons of Fëanor ended up fostering Elrond and Elros. Together, Earendil and Elwing sailed west to plead with the Valar for aid, and because of their courage, the Valar finally intervened. The War of Wrath followed, and Morgoth was cast out of the world through the Doors of Night, and all of Beleriand sank beneath the waves due to the turmoil. The elves who remained migrated west over the Blue Mountains and into regions like Lindon, Eregion, and Lorien. Eventually, Elrond would flee the destruction of Eregion by Sauron and use his new ring of power to create the refuge of Rivendell. Galadriel would also move to Lothlórien and plant the Malorn trees and become ruler with Celeborn. And now, when you return to The Lord of the Rings, Rivendell suddenly feels different. Lothlórien feels different. These places aren't just old, they're memorials. Tiny lights preserving the memory of Gondolin, Nargothrond, Doriath, and all the realms that once filled the world before it sank forever into the sea. When the elves speak of fading, this is what they mean. When Galadriel looks into the west, these are the memories she carries. When Elrond sings of ancient days, these are his lost homelands. The First Age was the age of elven realms, mighty, tragic, beautiful, and though nearly all of them were destroyed, their memory shaped everything that followed. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe to You Shall Not Scroll for more tales of Middle-earth's forgotten ages. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.